I think, to me, the magic of plein-air painting is in the relationship between the artist and their environment. It's not so much about the painting itself, but about being present in the moment. Just detaching from the rest of the world and truly taking in space for what it is. It gives you time to appreciate and reflect and time to breathe. It's too easy, especially in today's world, to get caught up in the bustle and forget the beauty, because it is beautiful, and painting in nature gives me the opportunity to remember that. Once you start painting outdoors, you start to see the world a little bit differently. Start noticing the nuances that you normally would overlook. Once you learn to appreciate a rock or a branch, suddenly everything is something worth admiring. And I think that's what makes it worth doing.
Hi, I'm Alex Foltz, and today we're in Highgate, Vermont. We are at the dam, and I'm gonna paint a little scene out here. We've got this nice little outcropping of rocks and a small waterfall next to them. In this case, I might change a few elements to kind of make this look a little more natural, because the waterfall is a result of the dam. But I think I can work around that and come up with something interesting. And yeah, the rocks are a fun opportunity to work with something a lot more geometric than most landscapes. And I think it'll offer a chance to really capture the light and capture the shadows in a scene like this. So without further ado, let's get right into it. All right. Let's see. Okay. I was playing around with doing this as a vertical composition, but as I'm looking at it, it really feels like it's better suited for a horizontal one. So we'll stick with that. Our perspective is a little different than you would normally expect, so that can always lend itself to some, something weird in the final picture. But you kind of just got to go with your gut, and if something catches your interest, give it a shot. At the worst, you lose a couple hours and you learn something valuable, and at the best, you come out with a painting you're proud of. We've got the usual palette here: burnt umber, ultramarine blue, cadmium yellow light, alizarin crimson, and titanium white. It's a limited palette. I always work with a pretty limited palette. As long as you have a palette that has very strong primary colors, you really aren't very limited on how many colors you're capable of mixing. And with a palette like this, you're almost never going to use any of the colors straight out of the tube. So it really encourages you to be creative with your color choices and mix whatever color you want. The first thing I'm going to do here, this is always my first step in any painting, is to tone the palette. We want to knock back that bright white so that it'll be easier to see what colors we're laying on top. All right, that ought to do it. Really just want enough to make sure we're not staring at a white canvas. This is a scene that has a lot of shadow and a couple of really bright spots of light. So I have to try to find a way to compose it in an interesting manner, which can be tough. There'll be no sky here. But we'll see how it goes. Now that we've got the canvas all toned, I can start marking in an idea of where I want the elements of this painting to be. First and foremost, there is a waterfall in this bottom corner, and I want to make sure that I get that. So I'll mark that in. That'll be the top of the waterfall. And it very quickly comes down into rushing rapids down here. There's an interesting little outcropping here that I want to capture. But really, the thing that I'm most interested in this scene is the rocks on this side. They're very square, sharp angles, sort of geometric, and I like that. There's a lot of flat planes that are catching the light in an interesting way. And that's something I want to make sure shines through in this piece. And the nice thing about this orange underpainting is that there is plenty of reflected light bouncing up and onto the rocks, and it gives a lot of the shadow side a sort of orangey tone. So I'll be able to use the color that I've put in my underpainting to my benefit here. Let's see. I do want to get a general idea of these rock formations down. Again, I am not looking for a lot of detail in this phase. And because this is such an odd subject, I may even leave some areas slightly unpainted. I think this is a scene that would look really nice in a sort of sketchy state rather than something that has been brought to full detail. And as I'm painting here, I'm just looking for strong shapes that I see. Trying to break the whole scene down into those strong shapes. And we've got a nice shadow here on the water. And this area up here is mostly in shadow. So just to get an idea of that, I'll mark that in as well. And again, this isn't a painting where I've planned the composition quite as much as I did in a lot of the other ones. I don't know what to expect because this is such an odd scene, but I'm just gonna play it out. And this might be something that I bring back to the studio and use as a reference for a larger, more full-fledged project in the future. And because there are a few parts of this scene that are almost pure white, I don't want this underpainting to bleed into those areas. So I'll come in here with some mineral spirits and just pull off some of that orange paint. Let that white come back through. All right. Okay. And with that, I think I'm ready to go ahead and get some color down. Again, at the start, I'm going to work with a larger brush just to block in the general colors and the general idea of what I'm going for here. And as I get into the later parts of the process with more detail in the work, I'll move to smaller and smaller brushes. The color that I am catching the most here is this sort of gray blue of the shadow side of the rock. And a good way to mix a gray blue is to just add a touch of brown to it and a little bit of white. And I'll be working transparently here. When you work with really transparent paint, the brush itself will kind of push that paint away from the canvas and break it up a little bit. And it can leave you with some really interesting natural texture all on its own. as I work my way across, I'm kind of letting the paint thin out on my brush, and will give me a more subtle color in these areas, because we're getting a lot of reflected orange light bouncing up on these rocks here. And we've got a hint of this same blue down here. Up at the top, got a lot of shadowed foliage, really deep green. I'll throw that color in. And all of this dark will help give some contrast and make those areas where the light is hitting that much more interesting to look at and convincing. Got some more of this deep green down here in the water. And up here at the mouth of this waterfall. And before we get too carried away here, I'm going to pull back a little bit of this and bring some of that orange underpainting through. This area of the rock is catching a lot more light, but it's still got plenty of interesting shadows playing around. All right. I want to move into a few of my brighter colors now. And I've got this beautiful green in the water. And a couple spots of that same green kind of pooling here in the rocks. And the water lower into the water here, or the rather the water in the lower part of this scene is not quite as intense as the rest of it. Let me add more brown and white to kind of pull that color back and make it a little more gray. And because this is a scene with a lot of smaller shapes in it, I'll move to a small brush a little earlier than I normally would. Again, my favorite part is probably this rock face here, so I want to make sure that I'm catching what I want there. A little brighter than that. I want to be careful not to cover up all of what I've already painted in this area, so that there's plenty of variation in the colors. And I don't want to let one color go too far, so I'll just hit it in a few important spots and then mix something different. And you can kind of see how overlaying these thin strokes that I did in the beginning, and then the colors that I'm mixing now on top of it, in just little rectangles, starts kind of creating this illusion of a very geometric rock formation. And continue to step back frequently to see it from a distance. There we go. I'll come in with just a little bit of this blue and kind of lightly scrub it into this area to make that orange not quite as drastic, but it's still there. I kind of want to move into this area. It's not the brightest spot in the painting, but you definitely have some brighter colors here. I'm kind of trying to move from dark to light as I work. Oftentimes you'll see that if your light source is warm, then your shadows will be cool. And if your light source is cool, then your shadows will be warm. So I want to have this sort of back and forth play of warmer and cooler colors throughout the painting. And up here we have a bit of the rock that's getting a lot more direct sunlight. The colors I use here are going to be a lot brighter. Now, in reality here, the shadow that I'm seeing here is being cast by the bridge itself, but I really want this to look like a nature scene and not a man-made area. So I'm going to try to soften this shadow a little bit, and hopefully it'll imply that maybe there's just a tree that's casting a shadow down here or something like that. That'll just kind of help it feel a little more wild. All right. I think I'll do a similar thing up here and introduce a little shadow into the rock face, just to help show that this is an area where there are a lot of trees and dense wilderness. There. I like that. And maybe a tad up here on these rocks as well. We're getting a little closer to the maybe more interesting parts of this scene. I think I'm ready to start working in this waterfall a bit more, and some of the light that's hitting these rocks and the foliage in that area as well. Well, as the waterfall goes around this curve and starts to froth a bit, we get some nice whiter spots here in the water. And as I start to work on this foam that's kicking up from the waterfall, I want to let my brush strokes kind of get a little more loose and sporadic. It's nice to have that contrast between the very sharp geometric shapes of the rocks and this sort of sporadic noise of the waterfall. I also want to let my brush kind of just naturally blend these colors together too, to sort of soften any edges that are happening in here. Again, it kind of shows that the water is misting out, but it also will stand out against all of these rocks. Then this area where the light is really catching the water is going to be the brightest part of the painting.
17.
Likely it'll be the area that the eye wants to draw to the most. But I still want to keep it soft, even though it is going to demand so much attention. So as I pull my brush along, I'm just letting up the pressure at the end of the stroke to allow it to soften up a bit as it goes over this curve. And I'll use this bright white to sort of cut that shape of the rock out a little better. Here at the bottom, it's just almost pure mist. Alrighty. I like the waterfall right about there. Seeing one other element that I really like out here that wasn't as present before is sort of this area of the water where the sky is catching in the reflection a little more. I don't want to overdo it, but I do want to bring some of that in here, so. Just a little bit. Okay. I think we're about ready to start working on this area up here as well. Again, this is one of the brighter sections of the painting. I really want to communicate that feeling of bright sunlight. And so I'm going to make sure to not make this too dark. It needs to be almost as bright as the brightest sections in the water in order to work. And I'll be sure to introduce plenty of variation in color up here. Probably subtle. Okay. There are a couple of these vertical areas of the rock that are catching light too, but I don't want them quite as bright as the top facing portions. So I'll tone that down just a tad for those. I'll tell you what, let's pick a spot in these rocks to make a brighter, more interesting point to look at. Maybe that can be this cliff face right here. There. Now we're getting that sense of really bright light. I like that. We'll take that over here too. And we'll let it bleed into this spot as well. Okay. I really like that. Now that I have this sort of relationship between where the light is hitting the rocks and where they're in shadow, I can make better judgments on what parts need to be a little darker or a little brighter to get the point across that I'm trying to get. I see a couple spots in the rocks down here that I think could use just a hint more light to really get them looking like they're facing the proper angle. So I'll just introduce this slightly brighter color here. And that will help communicate that these rocks are tilted up some. Which I really like. And we've got a couple of rocks right here next to the flowing river that are catching more light as well. Now up here, and I've been avoiding it the whole time because I don't know if it'll be good or not, but we're going to try it and see what happens. Up here, there is this nice little shrub that's catching a ton of light. I'm going to start marking in some of these grassy shrubs here. A lot of them are kind of climbing down the side of the cliff, and as they go down, I'll make sure they get darker so they look like they're in shadow. And I'm just giving the hint of some grass here as well. Now, get that shrub in place. We'll go with a nice, bright, vibrant green for this. Can help play off some of the more subtle greens in the water, but it'll also help the shrub stand out. All right. Just adding a couple of cracks in the rock here. This is a step that could be really easy to overdo. We don't want to downplay the subtle textures that we put in before, but we do want to highlight that there are really some deep gouges in these old rocks. All right, make one more good one right here. and we'll soften that edge to make it look like an overhang. All right. And I think with that, we can call it finished and put a signature on it.